afternoon. We start this short press media briefing. I want to present myself. I'm Swoboda. I'm from Austria. I was for a long time member of European Parliament and now president of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. And together with NOW, we organized this very efficient meeting in Kampala, Uganda, about migration and the younger generation. The basic idea was and is that we wanted to bring together responsible politicians, experts, migrants, refugees, young activists, in order to develop a joint program, joint from these people, joint also from European and African perspective, how Europe and Africa, or Africa and Europe, should deal with the issues of migration and especially, of course, of forced migration, but also how we can develop policies of empowering the younger generation in this continent to take common responsibility and ownership of its own continent, its own country, its own region. I think the basic idea was, of course, to have the EU-Africa Summit in Côte d'Ivoire in mind, to bring forward some of the proposals, some of the ideas, some of the suggestions and recommendations for this EU-Africa Summit, Africa-EU Summit. And the second idea, the reason why we're here in Kampala is because Uganda, with all deficiencies and problems all these policies have, has a very well-developed policy on migrants and refugees. I think from a European perspective, we have to say that we can only envy what is happening here, how authorities try to have an inclusion for the refugees into the society, into the host community. It's not easy. And we heard, of course, many refugees also their problems, problems of distance between where they live and the schools and many other issues. But overall, also comparing sometimes with European countries, there is a very progressive migration policy being developed in this country. Now, what are the main recommendations? I want to go into details. I have colleagues here sitting who can deal with it. I think the major recommendations are saying that EU should see migration not as a threat, but also as an opportunity. EU should try to integrate migrants into European communities, fight against xenophobia and racism, open legal channels for migration as an alternative to the illegal, irregular, and very dangerous migration towards Europe, and should, of course, coordinate this strategy together with the African Union. And Africa, as such, has to do a big job in promoting good governance in order to resolve and prevent some of the conflicts, including some of the tribal conflicts. Has to take ownership also for the whole political situation, because if you don't care about what happens in your neighbor, the problems of your neighbor will be your own problems sooner or later. And especially concerning the African youth, give a lot of more chances and possibilities so that the African youth does not see migration as the only chance for advancement, but maybe in an orderly, controlled, and legal way as a possibility to advance their professional skills and so on. But I think the major element must be to promote education and skills here in Africa, for the primarily also for youth for Africa, and it's up also to the responsibility of African governments that they care for their citizens and the opportunities for their citizens, especially concerning jobs and incomes, which is a vital problem for the coming years. That is very brief overview. I will not now go into details, but ask my colleagues to come in with some of the recommendations they think of vital importance, and we want to transfer to the African Union, to the European Union, promote it in our peer group, so to say, as we decided to have now a Kampala NOW group, which is working together with a lot of NGOs in the coming, not only in the coming months, but also in the coming years, to promote the ideas and an exchange, or perhaps mention exchange. One of the important things is, of course, also exchange between young people from Africa and Europe to know each other better, to reduce and eliminate some of the prejudices, and to give examples, experiences handed over from one to the other. And there's, including, of course, a big role for the diaspora, not to forget the brothers and sisters at home and what they can do for the development in their home country. So maybe you're the next. Please, Bella.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity once again. My name is Bella Nshimirimana, Refugee Woman of the Year 2017. When we are looking on this perspective of African youth and migration, as a recommendation, as a refugee here in Kampala, I would like to recommend the European Union, African Union, the government of Uganda, to really give the space to this refugee youth and host community to see how, instead of, yes, they have to open their borders for the migration, yes, that is true, and also they have to give this youth the space on their countries to see that they can elaborate their plan, they can do something for themselves. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Once again, my name is Victor Ochen. I am the director of African Youth Initiative Network, which is a youth organization, human rights youth organization we formed 13 years ago when we were living in the IDP camp in northern Uganda, primarily to help us work to mobilize young people, to promote them to be actors of peace and justice. And over the period of time, we have been working to support the post-conflict communities in northern Uganda, but also working with the refugee population from South Sudan. We grew up side by side with the refugee, and our stories to us, being a refugee, being in the camp, is not something foreign to me. It means something very personal to me, because that's where I developed a new culture, a new tradition, and my beliefs, my thinking, my perception of life pretty much resonate around the life of people caught up in hardships. That's why for the last many years we've been doing this work. Also, in our continued effort, we are working with young people within the continent, primarily to address the question of migration or movement within the continent, also and across border. If you look more, well, there's a lot of talk about African youth migrating to Europe, but I think focus also should be more on Africans moving within Africa. This is an area that gives a green ground for action by the African Union. It's an opportunity that for the first time in many programs I've attended regarding the humanitarian crisis or refugee issues, the first time that I'm seeing an event in Kampala organized and is attended by the young people. It's always been attended on behalf of young people. But this time round, I'm very grateful that the National Institute of Peace, together with Act.Now, were able to convene an event in Kampala and brought young people from different parts of the continent. So that is a significant move, that we are not merely talking for them, but we are engaging them so that the voices coming forward is authentic voices from the grassroots, but also the one that is legitimately in touch with the reality. In terms of recommendations between Europe and Africa, I do think and I do know for sure that none of these two countries alone have all the answers. We need Africa fully on board, just as Europe is expected to be fully on board. We do not only share material resources, but we share deep, abiding history, enriched with a stronger culture that is calling, is quite inviting and enticing, that sometimes circumstance gives it an easy route for us to think that the only way we can get rid of the circumstance we are seeing in Africa is to look up to Europe, is to get out of the continent. I travel a bit, and every time I go out of the continent, I come back, I hear my colleagues asking me, what have you forgotten within Africa that you keep going and coming back? Simply because they're wondering that if you get opportunity to get out of the continent, you should leave. But we are saying yes, there are also majority of young people in the continent who are saying, we don't want to go anywhere, this is our home, and we want to work towards protection, towards prevention. So one of the major recommendations that we came up with from this conference was focus should be towards prevention of crisis. Most of the crises in Africa right now are pretty much predictable. We know where the next conflict is going to happen. We witness ingredients of what leads to other conflicts in other countries happening in so many countries. So I think this is a wake-up call for African Union to work towards engaging the young people as conflict preventers, not as fighters. Because if you look more into the humanitarian crisis, and refugees are not only predominantly young people, but also the fighters. People causing the refugee situation, active in the battlefield are the young people, who some of them are hopeless. They feel hated by everybody, by the system, by their government, by United Nations, by international communities, just because they lack the voice. So what we need is to work towards prevention. If European Union and Africa could work more towards strategizing a platform, a roadmap for conflict prevention, that would be a way of addressing the situation. And then something also very important is we need to mobilize the young humanitarian leadership, where young people are active leaders in humanitarian situation. Because if we keep looking at the humanitarian crisis with a Western lens, crisis starts in Africa, we want to look for money from Europe, we want to look for money from America. We end up reinforcing the feeling of victims. But we are saying in the struggle for humanitarian response, we are all actors, we are all key players. So reinforcing the mechanism that mobilizes the local potentials, the local response mechanisms, and laying a platform where we nurture greater society where war falls in disfavor among the young people. This is an opportunity for us to think in long term that we want to work towards a future where humanitarian crisis is mitigated, is prevented, but most importantly, leaders of today and tomorrow are the key players in that, because without it, we are going to make sure that humanitarian crisis is a business to some people. But also, let's look at Africa being a land that is quite fertile. We should be not having this food crisis. The food security should not be a question in Africa, given the land opportunity, arable land in Africa. This is an opportunity for us to mobilize. There's a lot of resources for humanitarian response. Imagine if United Nations made it a priority that at least 50% of the local relief support is purchased locally. This would create an opportunity for young people to want to go and invest in their vast, fertile land. Simply because if youth have nothing to lose, they will not fear to destroy. They will not fear to leave. They will leave because they have nothing to keep, nothing to protect. But we can make this, we can turn this around. And above all, last point I want to say is international communities, especially European Union that has resources, should help support the local humanitarian actors. Lower the resources, low enough for the local organization, the local youth organization, the local civil society to be able to tap, because they are pretty much bystanders. They stand and witness, they see international NGOs coming in with all the resources, and they're treated as maybe they're volunteers. But we are saying these are the people who remains behind. They're the people who are there before international communities, before UN comes in. There will always be local communities, there will always be local civil society. Besides, they understand the culture, they understand the history, they understand the beliefs, which is important that we make resources available for the local actors, and most importantly, for the youth organization. If we give them that opportunity, we will not make only life easy for refugees, but we'll also make refugee hosting rewarding for the host communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now you heard an East African voice, who anyway became a victor from being a victim before. But now we have somebody from West Africa. We are very glad that a lot of experts came also from West Africa to show and to share with us their experience. And Matthias, I want to ask you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. My name is Matthias Esene. I work for the International Center for Migration Policy Development, the ICMPD, headquartered in Vienna, Austria. ICMPD is part of the consortium implementing a project in West Africa called the Free Movement, Support to Free Movement of Persons and Migration in West Africa. Personally, I'm happy to be in Kampala to be part of this process, because again, I am an African youth. A few things came out very astounding for me during the process we had past 2 days. The first is the fact that Kampala has demonstrated to us that, yes, the spirit of solidarity that has always been part of the African culture has strong basis for us to be able to support the displaced persons among us, given the fact that out of 40 persons that live in Uganda, 1 is a refugee. So I think many countries in Africa, and perhaps all part of the world, should emulate, and not just emulate, also support Uganda in what Uganda is doing. And coming to recommendation, the first is the fact that it's important that we begin to change the narratives about migration. That migration in itself is not a negative thing. Migration is part of human experience. Migration in the globalized world is a reality. What is important now is the responsibility that we all bear as regional blocks, as member states, individual countries, governments, as citizens of different countries, as youth. First, for the youth, the basic question we should ask ourselves is, how do we become innovative? How do we become creative? How do we become resourceful? Once we are able to do that, we realize that migration will no longer be the only or first opportunity, only or first choice that we have to make, but will be one of several opportunities and choices that we have to make. I think that is the message we should take home. Then for government in Africa, I think the government should be more responsive and responsible and create opportunity for youth to truly realize their potentials. And for regional blocs, for AU and the EU, of course, they should continue to provide the legal framework at the international level and provide support to government institutional structure to be able to address some of these challenges. As citizens, we all have the responsibility to make life better for ourselves. It's important, during conflict, for instance, you have the actors are individuals, they are human beings, even if you have external support. But people, carry guns. It is their choice. When the choice is limited, when the environment does not give that opportunity for them to do that, we realize that, of course, on the flip side of it, they may be able to contribute positively. So it is the responsibility of everybody, the citizens, institutions of government, regional blocs, to support this whole process, because migration itself cannot be isolated from other social problems that we experience in our society.
Thank you very much. And now we have a member from European Parliament, Kati, Piri.
Thank you. I think to start actually with what Matthias said, that migration is of course nothing new. And unfortunately also refugees have always been there. Actually, the history of Europe is the basis for the international refugee law. But 2015 was perceived by many people in Europe as a moment that we received over 1 million refugees, of course, due to the Syrian crisis. And it created the feeling of being out of control. And this, of course, also empowered some xenophobic, extremely right-wing political parties. And politicians, there was nothing more difficult for a politician to answer than how many people can we still expect this year. And if a politician would be honest, he would say, we don't know. We don't know if it will be 100,000 people. We don't know if it will be 1 million. We don't know if it will be 2 million. And that, of course, was the drive also, that when it comes to refugees, the whole international community has an obligation. And we all know here in Africa that actually most refugees stay close to home. No one wants to go to the other side of the world. And here in Uganda, we see that over 1 million people, mainly from 3 countries, but of course especially also from South Sudan, are being taken care of by their neighbors. And this means that also the international community, EU included of course, needs to help these governments, need to help the organizations on the ground to fulfill our joint international commitment to make sure refugees can live peacefully and with dignity in a country until their home country is torn apart by conflict. When it comes to migration, I think biggest shame for the whole world is that how the Mediterranean Sea turned into the biggest graveyard. I don't think anyone can be happy with the situation the way it is now. And therefore also, as Swoboda said, I think legal routes are the only way forward. Any politician believing that you can stop migration is lying. And until you think from the assumption that migration can be stopped, and unfortunately too many leaders in Europe think from that assumption, you will create wrong policies. And this is of course where also European leaders want to see quick fixes. And we see an externalization of border management coming from Europe all the way to Northern Africa. While I think we all discussed the last 3 years that if you look at the reasons why people are willing not just to pay thousands of dollars, but to pay with their lives, there must be serious issues there. And I think legal routes on the one hand, but also, as was mentioned also by the other participants, to make sure that in terms of status, your highest status is not leaving your own country. You need to have the opportunities to develop. Everyone has the right to try to have a better future. And young people are just as ambitious here in Uganda or other African countries than as they are in Europe. And for me it was an eye-opener to be here for 3 days and to hear all these pictures that we have, the pictures that exist in Africa from Europe, but the other way around, the pictures we have from the perceptions we have from Europe in Africa, to hear from the young people here their aspirations and how we can jointly work together, not to stop migration, but to manage it and to make it not the only way out for people who want to improve their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions, remarks from your side?
A refugee since 2011 from Burundi because of the political instability which was in my country. Then I was invited here as Refugee Man of the Year 2017. I'm here in Kampala. Yes, I stay. No. Yes, thank you.
But Kampala is better than a camp.
Okay, normally here in Uganda, refugees, they don't live, they don't stay in settlement. Also, we have right to live where we feel free. So that's why you are seeing me here in Kampala. We are having a community of refugees here in Kampala, whereby we are trying to say that you can cope up with this Ugandan life and trying to see that you can promote peaceful coexistence among refugees and host community.
You said you've been here since 2011?
Yes.
Yeah, we invited refugees because it was mentioned, also I think by Victor and Kati and others, that we don't want to speak about refugees, but with them and see their way. And therefore we have refugees of Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. I think basically that were the countries. We invited refugees and had discussions with them, and they were participating as Bella, you know, with all the others. And that was really, really, I mean, moving to see how they engage themselves, also for their own rights, their own possibilities, and using these possibilities, giving to them. So that, I think, was a great issue. And I would like many politicians and leaders, also from Europe, to have that kind of contact and dialogue, because then some decisions and some words which are taken by them would be different when they see what is behind a refugee. It's not numbers, it's personalities. And we really had, like Bella, personalities here who were active in their community, but as Bella said, also in the host community. Well, I ask of course the colleagues also to answer. It's our clear determination that everybody who was participating is doing his and her job in her community, in her political channels, to work in that direction. Of course, the people in Africa, but also the people in Europe, like Kati in the European Parliament, and Victor in the leadership, and we have other colleagues here also. We will organize an event in Abidjan in view of the conference. Of course, we had the minister responsible for emergency and refugees here in Kampala, in Uganda, who was quite a lot of time with us and promised, of course, when he will go there in different fringe events, also to bring that to the knowledge. We know we are not the only one. And people will not just say, okay, there was a conference in Kampala, we just do what they want. But it's also not only for the conference, but it's a long-term project we want to develop. But of course, to try to get the message through is an important issue every one of us is undertaking.
Yeah, I think on the question of the concerns about African Union not being fed enough with what is the views and priorities on the ground, yeah, it is kind of a very calling concern in a way that there is, the truth of the matter is, from the responsibility point of view, a lot of African things, African Union is not doing enough to address the question of humanitarian crisis, especially on migration and all that. But also, the politics of African Union is a bit complex in a way, because humanitarian response requires resources. But also, AU in most cases get their support from European Union, their partners, in order to facilitate the humanitarian process. But most importantly, the young people are calling and they're saying, there's just so much that African Union can do, of which among them, the areas of prevention, of areas of mobilization of potentials, of young leaders within the continent listening, creating that platform where there's a means of channeling the voices and concern to the leadership of African Union. But above all, there should be effective means of response to answer the question of humanitarian situation by African Union. The ability to respond is one concern that remains to be bothering many young people, that African Union seems politically committed, but there's lack of practical response when it comes to that. Maybe practical, timely response is lacking. And that's why young people are saying we need an institution that is effectively and timely responding to the situation at hand. And also, we cannot blame EU for the crisis going on within the continent right now. We can only call them, we can regard them as allies and partners in helping support us. But if not much is being done to prevent situation at home, then we are becoming, a non-functional institution, the one that is only there as a scapegoat, wouldn't respond timely. So young people want to see an effective African Union response timely to situation and work towards prevention, because there's so much they can do to address the humanitarian crisis, because movement is happening, but what is compelling people to move, to leave home from their countries to another countries within the continent, or to dare that much crossing the sea? The answer is here within Africa, and that's why African Union leadership is required now.
As I'm from the European Union, and as you know, we had a year ago a Brexit decision in Great Britain, and whenever you speak, with crowds in my country, in the Netherlands, not everyone is always very enthusiastic about European integration. So for me, it was very nice and inspiring to see here how the youth from the grassroots is calling for that cooperation. And if I would be a politician here, I would be proud of the youth making this call. There is a strong wish for more cooperation, be it on the humanitarian side, be it when it comes to conflict prevention, be it when it comes to dialogue with the youth, be it when it comes to mobility within Africa. My humble advice would be for the leaders to grasp this opportunity. If you have this grassroots wish to have this stronger African cooperation, which we all know you have challenges beyond the borders. You always have challenges which you can only solve if you're together. I think it would be a huge step forward, especially if you see that it's a grassroots request. It's not something top down, it's really coming from the young leaders during the last 3 days.
Yeah, for me, the primary responsibility to address issues relating to displacement and migration lies with individual member states. I mean, of course, the regional blocks only provide opportunity for countries to forge a common agenda and, of course, again, create a platform for dialogue. In West Africa, for instance, in my introduction, I mentioned that ICMPD is part of a consortium implementing the project support to free movement of persons and mobility in West Africa, funded by the EU, and the other partners are the IOM and the ILO. And we are engaging with the ECOWAS Commission to promote the regional integration in West Africa through free movement of persons, rights of establishment, and rights of residence. And we understand that the AU also has the aspiration to see a free movement within the African migratory space. So I think what we really need to do is to reinforce our engagement with each of these member states, because an institution, whether it's a regional bloc, is as strong as, or is rather a reflection of the member states that forms that institutions. Thank you.
Me, what I say is we always have our recommendation, but sometimes we feel like there's no implementation. But what I can say that we cannot lose hope, because if we are seeing how as refugees and host community we are trying, we are having youth-led initiative, like what we have heard from my colleagues like Yarit, Ayan, Mira Group and other youth-led initiative. We are trying to see that we can bring change among us youth. So I can say that not having our eyes in this big institution like African Union, European Union, but it has to start from us. We are, what we are doing, where we are going, to see that we can bring that change.
It was one of the main debate also that we have in many countries, good laws, but the implementation is very often deficient and lacking. And it will not come by itself, by leaders saying, oh, now we have to implement, unless there's a pressure from below. So I think we don't differentiate or say we only need a strong African Union. Yes, we need it, or you need it, Africa needs it, in order to be a real partner to the European Union. Of course, we need the national governments because they have a budget and are responsible, but the local government as well, local authorities very often, and of course, citizens, partners in the civil society. And maybe to the end, I want to take up what one of the colleagues who is sitting in behind, who is a founder of a school, said in a debate, we all have to take our responsibility. Because is everybody waiting for the other to do something? I think that doesn't work. And therefore, I'm very happy also that, for example, refugees or migrants, there's a migrant here from Mali who is in Vienna, they just don't do only their job and care for themselves. Also, migrants have a lot to do to care for themselves, but I want to do my job and take my responsibility also for others, for the migrants, for the host community. And anyway, and finally, we should not have always these divisions. But they are living in a society, and it would be very good the society takes them as full members, and they can contribute to the development of the society. That very often forgotten also in Europe, that migrants very often help our societies to develop, especially, of course, in areas where we have a lack of population and not a surplus of population. In that sense, I want to thank you very much that you came and attended this press or media briefing.